Welcome to the House of Mourning. Hey there, I'm your host, Joëlle, and this podcast is a space where my guests and I explore the raw, unfiltered truths and inner knowings we tap into in grief and in life after loss and trauma. We reject societal norms that condition us into bypassing and fast-forwarding through the work of healing. My personal desire to normalize grief is the result of my own healing journey, having lost my father at the age of 33, and most recently, the death of my second son late term in pregnancy. For those of you that find yourself in grief, recalibrating after loss, or healing from trauma, I honor you. Perhaps you are here because you are navigating, supporting a loved one who is grieving, or on a healing journey. If so, way to show up for yourself and them. Wherever you are on the journey, all of you is welcome here. We have the lovely Dr. Mekel on today. Let me tell you a little about her. Dr. Mekel Harris. Her bio is that she received a bachelor's in psychology from Baylor University, a master's in psychology from Houston Baptist University, and a PhD in clinical school psychology from the University of Houston. She currently works in private practice as a licensed psychologist and CEO of Harris Psychological Services, LLC, offering mental health support across the lifespan. Dr. Harris also provides training, education, and consultation to organizations around the globe focused on an array of mental health themes. Finally, and most recently, she is the co-founder of Bloomwell Partners, LLC, a consulting firm that equips corporate entities with the skills necessary to afford grief-informed leadership and care within the workplace. Side note, one of my most favorite things on the planet. Like, oh my gosh, I have no words for this. Anyhow, throughout the past decade, Dr. Harris has presented at over 30 domestic and international conferences and has been interviewed on several podcasts with topics ranging from grief and loss to community mental health and trauma. Dr. Harris has been featured as a mental health expert in countless TV features, magazines, and articles. And as well, she is an author, because why wouldn't she be with this CV of her book called Relaxing into the Pain. Welcome, Dr. Mekel. In my heart, you're like, oh, you're like my shero. Thank you.
Joelle, I just love you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Every time I hear that, a part of my mind goes to how in the world have I slept in the past 20 years? But it's been such a great journey. And I'm so grateful to just be in this space with you and to share our experiences with your audience. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you. And I've shared with this with you in the past is like everything you're doing, everything that you have accomplished, are accomplishing, are forging forward in this space is a true heartfelt desire of alignment of what I hope to do a speckle of. And so tell us, what has led you to become a grief educator and expert, Dr. Mekel?
Yeah, so I'll first say that you are already, Joelle, doing the good work of education around grief and loss. House of Mourning is such a necessary space. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do in the future. So I will say that I never thought in a million years that grief and loss would be my emphasis area. I actually started my career in early childhood. I was working with children with an array of developmental disabilities and their families. Loved that. Put too many miles on my car in Houston, Texas, driving to homes and engaging with families. But the theme that I saw even then, even though I wasn't able to recognize it as grief, was that families were really wrestling with navigating what's next. What does that mean for their identity as parents? Navigating the grief around their children's diagnoses. So, flash forward, I decided that I wanted to get my master's degree. And in that space, I had the opportunity to serve as a pediatric mental health provider for children diagnosed with cancer. So that was really the first entree into physical death.
Mhm.
And yet, because I'm stubborn and hard headed to a large degree, I didn't make those connections quite yet. So in 2012, I was working on my postdoctoral fellowship at Children's Hospital LA. And I got a phone call from my mom. And this was about early November 2012, and where she shared that she received diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And that was the beginning of a very devastating and significant shift in my family's lives. That moment just solidified that I needed to shift my career. 30 days after that phone call with my mom, she died. Uh, so I knew after my mom's diagnosis and her death 30 days later that I needed support for myself. And I was a psychologist at that time and realized much later on, probably about a year into it, that this was a niche that I needed to focus on. It wasn't sexy, but I knew it was necessary. So for the past 11 years, I have predominantly focused on grief and loss through my private practice, through my writing and engagements, podcast, all of these things, and also Bloomwell, as you mentioned. So it's been quite a journey and one that has deeply shifted and enriched my life in many ways.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel you when you say never thought I would be here, and this has
Mm-hmm.
been the trajectory
Mm-hmm.
of my journey, right? And
Mm-hmm.
with your grief education,
Mm-hmm.
what is a goal that you have, like an overarching agenda or, goal of like, what do you want people to, for lack of a better word,
Mm-hmm.
get?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. That is one of the three sort of pillars through everything that underlies what I do. And I think the main thing that I want people to know is that grief is an individual experience and that it's not linear. I spend a lot of time in my practice one on one with clients, as well as reminding myself sometimes that even though we sort of hear in society about the stages of grief and we want to really view this as a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 linear process with an end point, grief is not that. It ebbs and flows. And I think within that, as people who grieve, as and also those who are supporting those who are grieving, we have to extend that compassion to understand that it's not linear. That would be the primary focus.
Right. And that is the primary understanding,
Mhm.
quote unquote,
Mhm.
interpretation of
Yeah.
what society seems to have like clung onto.
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't even know if that's even a word, but
Yeah.
is like it just that seems to be what people think the most, and then put
Mhm.
all these expectations
Mhm.
on themselves
Right.
and people in grief, and it does not help.
It doesn't. I think one of the things that makes this extra challenging is that we are sort of existing in this biomedical framework and we're trying to sort of retrofit grief into that. So for example, if I have a physical injury, I go to my doctor, there's a series of lab tests, there's a quantitative metric to understand what's going on. I'm prescribed something or, offered some sort of support, the medical issue resolves and there's no trace of what was previously there. And if you think about grief, we want to do that, right? Wouldn't that be nice that we sort of have this injury, we go in for support, and then when we look back, we don't see the residue of what was previously there. But that's not how that works. But I do think the biomedical framework makes it extra difficult to wrap our mind around that idea. And then also, I think the way that we are wired neurologically is to
Mhm.
compartmentalize, right? We tend to think of dichotomies: good versus bad, evil versus good, right versus wrong. And grief, again, is not a black and white process, but psychologically, if we can compartmentalize grief into a I've done it, it's over, right? Beginning, end, it's a
Mhm.
safer sort of space, but it's also potentially dangerous and damaging to the spirit when we don't allow ourselves to actually lean into the process and fully excavate the things that often arise.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And, you know, with your company, Bloomwell, I'm
Hmm.
curious to know how that came about because
Yeah.
grief informed workplaces. I mean, I found
Hmm.
one TED Talk about it. There seems to be next
Hmm.
to zero. I mean, obviously, this is why you're doing what you're doing,
Yeah.
right? But it's like,
Hmm.
where did this come from? Because I wish there were 1,000 more branches of Bloomwell out there. And like, I wish this wasn't so new as an idea. Like, imagine that. Grief informed. We're
Yeah.
we're starting to wrap our brain around trauma informed being a household
Hmm.
name, verbiage, what have you.
Hmm.
Still struggling on what living that means for myself, for
Hmm.
for I think a lot of people.
Hmm.
However, grief informed is like, huh? Why?
Yeah.
Like there's it's just, especially corporate America. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I just am really grateful for Instagram, right? The social media space. So on my platform on Instagram, Dr. Mekel, I engage in bi-weekly interviews with folks from all around the world because when my dad died, this was right at the beginning of COVID. And instead of interacting with squares on Instagram, I thought, this is a way to maintain social contact, and it's also a way for me and others to be supported as we grieve. And so I found myself reaching out to people on Instagram who shared similar, ideas and wanted also to learn a little bit more about grief and loss. So Janet William Wright, she is the founder of what's called the Mother Love Project.
Hmm.
And that's totally dedicated for people who've experienced the death of their mothers. So she offers support in Canada and also through an online platform for people to share their stories of mother loss. So I reached out to her and said, "Would you be willing to have a conversation through an Instagram live and talk about what you offer?" And she said yes. There was something about Janet that, because I've experienced the loss of a mother as well, I was just deeply connected to her. And so we maintained contact after that IG live and realized that her corporate experience and work within HR and organizations in Canada, and my clinical experience, as well as personal interactions in the corporate space, were the dynamic duo. And so we put our heads together and said, there's a need here. I think one of the things that happened with COVID-19 is that it elevated conversations about grief and loss because workspaces were seeing, number one, employees were dying. Family members of employees were dying. So there was really no escaping, and just the loss associated with not being able to be in the workplace, not being able to engage daily routines and have social contacts. So all of these invisible losses were now sort of thrust into the work environment. And so when we put our minds together, we said, let's sort of create a framework and a sequence of training to help embed or help empower leaders within organizations with the aim of it having a trickle down effect to their employees and beyond. So that is where this all started.
Wow, interesting that
Hmm.
COVID was such a big part of that. Like, it provided this mirror of like,
Hmm.
what, we got it. We got nothing else to do. We got to look here.
That's right. That's
And
right.
what is this invisible factor that is so connecting and yet confusing and
Mm-hmm.
yet, like I think um there's such a excuse me, there's such a permanence with grief and that
Mm-hmm.
part of it. Not that it's like we are gonna feel the same forever and it's always gonna be horrible and da, da.
Mm-hmm.
No, which I think is also a misunderstanding of
Mm-hmm.
pieces that are permanent in
Correct.
grief.
Right.
Um, but with COVID even is like this
Mm-hmm.
new, it's like looking at the world. I don't think this applies to everyone because I
Mm-hmm.
honestly do believe a lot of people have attempted to go back, quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote,
Mm-hmm.
pretend that like it didn't happen. But a lot of the world and
Yeah.
a lot of people feel like noticeably that they're
Mm-hmm.
different after
Yes.
COVID.
Yeah.
And the word that I attribute to that is transformation
Mm-hmm.
and grief. As I experienced it and experience it is transformative, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not it can be, and
Yes.
if you allow it, and it's not
Yes.
in like a, "Oh, yay, like, we got this, like, it's gonna be great. This is the
Right.
butterfly moment." Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not in this toxic positivity way, it's just
Correct.
it truly is, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it's undeniable,
It's undeniable. Yeah.
and
That
yet
that's the that's
oh,
the
sorry, go
essence.
ahead.
No, that's the essence, Joelle, of my book, Relaxing into the Pain, is this idea. And I love that you said it can be transformative because it can. That requires, however, that leaning into, or what I sort of frame as relaxing into the pain, so that the focal point can be on that loss and all the nuances that are sort of evolving as a result of it. And so within workspaces, you can imagine everyone sort of going back to work. We're back in this space. We're all experiencing different levels and types of losses. And employers, I'm sorry, are looking at this going, what do we do? I don't know how to interact with this. I don't know how to lead into that. How do I bring this up? Do I bring it up? And so, sort of back to Bloomwell, I think that it's a great opportunity to help educate, empower, and also um, create a framework for even rethinking policies and procedures within organizations, so that it's not a one touch intervention, if you will, with an employee. It really is embedded in the fabric of the organization that we're going to engage these conversations from here until the end of time. So that's our hope for this.
Right, in infusing it into the
Hmm.
culture. And
Yes.
I think that's the informed piece,
Hmm.
is grief can inform. And if
Absolutely.
we're also not letting it, right? And we're not
Hmm.
doing anything with it, like the information that we're getting from grief,
Hmm.
from people like in front of us being
Yeah.
different. And
Hmm.
it's like becomes this elephant in the room that we
Right.
choose to stay ignorant to.
Hmm.
Which, to be perfectly honest, I think applies to most relationships. Not most, but a lot of relationships where there's grief it's so relational, and so much of the
Hmm.
time it divides because
Hmm.
people, the non-grievers, don't have tools. I mean, I even as a griever, I'm kind of like, it's been hard,
Yeah. Yeah.
to there's the tools are lacking to connect through the grief, and
Hmm.
especially, I think in the US more than Canada, because we're just such a smaller country with COVID. And we're not going to get into politics here. However, like we took a very different stance on it in many ways than
Hmm.
you folks did in the States,
Uh-huh.
culturally and what have you. Just
Sure.
overall, we were locked down for a lot longer. We got the vaccines a lot later, you know.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but anyhow, the company I was working for during COVID and for the last decade prior to my most recent loss was American and is American, and
Hmm.
I would go to conferences in the States all the time. And the first conference I went to, like, after COVID, which it wasn't even
Hmm.
after COVID, but anyhow,
Yeah.
when we could meet,
Uh-huh.
um, was 2021,
Mhm.
and we were in Vegas, and I remember it was on September 11th, and the facilitator
Mhm.
said, you know, "We honor this day, we honor the lives lost."
Mhm.
And then they took it even a step forward, is like, you know, stand if you've lost someone in the last
Mm.
year, and
Wow.
we wanna honor you,
Mhm.
you know, and I'm telling you, Dr. Mekel, I almost fell off my chair as a
Mm.
Canadian
Mm.
surrounded by Americans. It was
Mhm.
like it looked like
Wow.
it was like every second person was
Wow.
standing for
Yeah.
after you know, COVID. So it's like, you know, we don't see that. We are walking around in our lives. You don't
Yep.
know who's in grief. You don't know who's not,
That's right.
especially in the workplace.
Mhm.
And the TED Talk that I found about it, it's a danger, maybe
Mhm.
not the right word, but it is so harmful to not be grief informed to
Yes.
your people,
Yeah.
in a corporate context. It harms, you know, that's why you lose people. It's
Right.
easy to lose people for that.
That's right. One of the statistics, or one of the sets of statistics that Janet and I looked at was with regard to lost productivity, and when people don't feel supported or seen within the workspace, um, or they're pushed to continue to maintain productivity in a space where they may be experiencing grief fog, fatigue, the physical, spiritual, emotional health consequences of grief, that they tend to leave organizations. Well, if you think about the cost of having to hire, retrain, all of that, what we're hoping to do again is sort of offer and infuse that grief informed framework so that employees are feeling supported, they're feeling safe to know that as their grief arises, they don't have to compartmentalize it. And there are leaders that are there to lean into that with them. We're not asking leaders to be therapists or psychologists, but we are saying that having conversations is a way to witness what's actually transpiring in the workplace. And it really is, I've said this ad nauseum, it's the witnessing of grief, right? It's not fixable, it's a lifelong journey, but the witnessing of grief is so powerful to the grieving heart. And in a workspace where there is no witnessing, that employee feels isolated, they may feel marginalized, they may feel stigmatized, embarrassed, ashamed. And so you can see that that's not a healthy work environment to be in. So
Mhm.
we're really excited about all the opportunities that we're going to offer. And I really appreciate you bringing up this space to talk about Bloomwell.
And yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be following closely because, you know, it's interesting. I want to switch. I want to take what you just said and
Hmm.
parallel it out of the
Hmm.
workplace
Okay.
because I find it so true
Hmm.
also in personal relationships. And
Hmm.
so, what advice do you have for people who are not feeling seen in their grief? Where people are surrounded by their closest family members, and their family members are also not engaging in those conversations, and
Hmm.
it's isolating and
Hmm.
upsetting, and it can cause, I'm finding, it's just a big question mark that
Yeah.
I don't know how to wrap my brain around.
Yeah.
And, you know,
I'll
like,
I'll
what
answer
would you
this.
say to that?
I'll answer this by sharing a little story from my own personal experience. So, when my mom died in 2012, I went into an emotional cocoon for almost a year. And I felt very angry at a lot of my close friends for not showing up in the ways that I expected or anticipated. So I had a phone call from a good friend of mine about 6 months, 7 months into my grief experience. And she said something that simultaneously angered me, and I knew that it was true. And the comment was, um, first of all, sort of a recognition of the attempts that she actually had made to text, to call, to send letters, to do things practically, and I couldn't see that. I couldn't see the support around me you know, as a grieving person, that grief can make you incredibly myopic as you're trying to just wake up and survive day to day. And even when support pillars are there, sometimes they're not recognized or recognizable. So she shared that. And then she said, well, Mekel, when we have talked and I've asked how you felt, you've said, I'm good. I'm fine. And that was my way. Number one, I was in a heavily grief avoidant season. That was
Mhm.
my way of protecting. And I was afraid that if I actually revealed the depth of my pain, that I may not survive that on
Mhm.
the other side. So, to answer your question, what can those who are grieving do? I think there really is a necessary, we've got to take that necessary step to name what's really going on. And that's so vulnerable. It's so difficult. It feels so raw to name the fact that you're not okay. Um, but it's okay if you're not okay. So I would offer that. And then
Mhm.
for the supporting person, we've got to ask some great questions. We've not, especially if we really have a close, intimate relationship with the person who's grieving, we've got to help sort of press a little bit beyond I'm good or I'm okay and lean into a series of questions. There's a free resource that I offer for those who are supporting people who are grieving, and it's called How to Support Someone Who's Grieving. It's a free little webinar just to get you thinking about some of the things that may come up for a grieving heart and some questions and observations that you can make so that person doesn't feel isolated. But as I mentioned, for the grieving heart, it is pressing into the truth and acknowledging
Mm.
that, not necessarily with everyone, but the key people, even if it's one person, and just sort of naming that can be extremely powerful. I shifted from complete anger to my friendships to recognition that um, there were people who showed up. I just couldn't see it, and I wasn't
Mm.
ready. I wasn't ready to name my own pain. Yeah,
Mm. Thank
that's a
you.
that's a
Thank
tough
you
one.
for
I know.
sharing. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, we'll move on.
Yeah.
Um, the concept of embodied wisdom and embodiment and
Hmm.
grief as an embodied experience
Hmm.
is dear to me. I know it's dear to you.
Hmm.
What do you believe is important for people to understand about, for grievers and non-grievers to understand about the embodied
Yeah.
experience of it?
Yeah. So I think often societally, when we think of grief, we solely view that as an emotional experience. And it is. It is. It can be very all consuming. When I think of embodiment, it's really this whole person impact of loss on the mind, on the body, on the spirit, on the finances, on the social relationships, on the ecology, the landscape of a person's life. And
Mm,
so, as we think about embodiment intervention, we've got to focus on all of those aspects. When my mom died, even though I was a psychologist, I hadn't made the connection for myself that grief was showing up in my body. I remember traveling to San Diego, and I went to get out of the car, opened the door, and my entire left side was paralyzed. I had to lift
mm,
my thigh out of the car and, and sort of like slam my feet with my hand up and down on the ground just to sort of wake and revive my leg. And that was probably the first realization in my own journey that grief wasn't just here, it wasn't just in my heart, that it literally was manifesting in my bones. And so, grief is a whole person experience, and we've got to do a better job at sort of naming that and intervening as such.
yes. And
Hmm.
I've been having like stabbing pains in my, like different pains. Like I have lived with, I've I had fibromyalgia, like, diagnosis 10 years ago, and I've
Mhm.
been pretty much symptom free for the last, like, 8.
Mhm.
And it's come out a little bit in some of those symptoms resurfacing again, like,
Mhm.
very little, but then
Mhm.
I've gotten new pains. Like, I have chronic neck pain, and I've been
Mhm.
getting these new pains in the middle of my back on
Yeah.
milestones,
Yeah.
like,
Yep.
on
Yep.
my son's due date and then on his 1 year, and it's like,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Of course, it's
Mhm.
connected, and it's not like I'm
Absolutely.
consciously like, "Let's give myself some back pain," you know? It's just
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
"Oh my god, my back," you know? It's so obvious and
Mhm.
yet confusing, and,
Mhm.
um, the trauma therapy that I've been experiencing,
Mhm.
uh, not EMDR, but ART, it's like I
Mhm.
can feel layers of
Yes.
my pain, like, leaving from my tissues,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
isn't like it's insane.
Well, I'll reference Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is just wrote an incredible book, The Body Keeps the Score, and it's talking about the impact of individual or isolated or cumulative trauma, and that shows
Mhm.
up, it resonates in our bodies. The body is keeping the score. And because I think, again, societally, we live in sort of a disembodied world. We're compartmentalized. Remember, I talked about our natural neurology, which is compartmentalization. So our body's doing one thing, our mind's
Mhm.
over there. Well, if you think about that, just that chasm between the mental digestion, the emotional digestion of the pain, and the physical, if we can work to recognize that the body's keeping the score, and then through interventions integrate those things, then we can set up a trajectory for folks to experience relief. And it's such a critical aspect of interventions. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, wow, and I'm reading that book. It's a long one.
It
It's,
is.
you know,
Yeah.
I'm experiencing it as a little dry, and yet I'm still reading it. It's still
Yes.
very, very important. Um,
Absolutely.
but the other piece that I also don't think gets touched on, is of the embodiment and embodied, you know, like one of the prongs that you spoke about the
Hmm.
spiritual aspect.
Yeah.
And not everybody's going to, you know, you're going to relate to that aspect in direct proportion to how much you relate to spirituality in general, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Um,
and to
but
clarify
for
here that
yourself, yeah,
spirituality is not religiosity. So it's not a faith prescription or adherence. It's however you're interpreting spirit. And so just to clarify that.
100%.
Hmm.
100%. And thank you for clarifying that. Couldn't agree more. And for yourself, what would you say are
Hmm.
the bigger spiritual pieces of wisdom, of embodied wisdom, of inner knowings that have come through you
Hmm.
in your grief and loss journey? And I'm asking after I'm like, wait a minute, that's quite a personal question,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if you're comfortable to
Yeah.
answer.
Absolutely, I
And if
am.
not, no worries.
Yeah, no, I am. I will say that each of us wakes up each morning and we anticipate a very consistent, linear, and predictable pattern of things that happen throughout their day. We wake up, we take a shower. For those who go to work, we drive to the office, we work all day, we come home, we may pick up our kids, and it's very predictable. Grief, whether it was an anticipated loss or a sudden loss, right? Or death, I should say, is completely discombobulating. It goes against sort of the natural order of things. And so that can lead one to ask some very important and deep spiritual questions, such as um, how does this fit within the natural order, right? How, depending on if you do ascribe to a specific faith, um, the allowance of the suffering associated with that death. And it can really create a lot of confusion and questions. For me, I think what it's done is helped me realize that life is not linear. Simple thought, but for me, it's been very revolutionary and actually very freeing to know I don't have to have it all figured out. I don't have to know what's next. And actually, the idea that I don't have to know frees me up because it's not on me to have the whole prescription, the whole vision mapped out. The only thing required of me today is to show up and to be open. So back to your comment about the possibility of transformation, I think that really has guided me to a space where I don't have to have it all figured out and I'm curious about what's next. And that has actually expanded my faith and my spiritual seeking. Um, and I know that's not the case for everyone. But again, there's possibilities inherent in this spiritual journey overall.
The possibilities.
Possibilities.
Yeah, it's a huge, deep, the concept of pushing back against everything we have been told about the
Hmm.
linear nature of things,
That's
and
right.
and it does bring up those questions,
Hmm.
right? It
Hmm.
brings up those questions, and for me, the biggest question that I was focusing on
Hmm.
spiritually, and I'm not
Hmm.
religious, so it's just
Hmm.
more of a spiritual soul thing for me,
Hmm.
is the difference between asking, "Why is this happening to me?" which didn't come up for me. That
Yeah.
question didn't wasn't authentic to me. The
Hmm.
question, and I know a lot of people ask it and feel that
Sure.
way.
Hmm.
And what was coming up for me spiritually was, why is this happening spiritually?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I often think in farming language within my own self. And that's a question that I too asked was why is this happening spiritually? And I had to really unpack that and really excavate. Grief for me sort of unearthed a lot of questions about relationships, a lot of questions about self trust, a lot of questions around my ability or inability to be present and grateful and all of these things. And so it was a lot of excavation. And still, 10 and a half years later, 11 years later, still pulling weeds, still discovering things that I'm not, I'm blind to now. But again, I think that over time, grief has remained the same. The way that I lean into it and the openness with which I have to do the excavation and exploration has definitely shifted. And I see that with a lot of individuals with whom I work. So just want to do a bit of encouragement if someone's listening thinking, well, I'm not there. I'm angry. I don't get it. I'm confused about why this is happening. That's perfectly fine. And to really exercise compassion wherever you are. And should a space be created within your experience to explore something different, be open to that. Be open to that. And you may be pleasantly surprised at what you may discover about yourself, your relationships, and your relationship to spirit.
Well, that's so beautiful. And before we close out with
Hmm.
sharing your contacts and
Hmm.
a couple things you're working on next,
Yeah.
do you have any other thoughts or info or pieces that you want to bring forth, just closing out for today, Dr. Mekel?
Yeah. So this will seem a little bit strange, Joelle, but one of the phrases that literally drove me nuts throughout my grief journey was this idea of holding space. It felt, when I heard that, and I knew that people had positive intent about holding space for the grief, um, it felt very nebulous to me. And I think for people who grieve, we're often sort of wondering, what do we do? How do we concretize these tools? How can we sort of embody beyond just going through it, which is very vague. And so I just want to offer some practical things for you to hold space for yourself. And that may be rest, right? Allowing your body to sort of regulate or down regulate, if you will, from all of the chaos that's happening within yourself. Um, it may be that you are leaning in and being curious about what's coming up and sort of excavating that a little bit more. It may be that you are setting firmer boundaries with people in light of relationships, or maybe you showing up more in relationships in light of the loss. So hold space for yourself in addition to allowing other people to hold space for you. So that would be what I would offer on a practical level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And for our listeners, you definitely want to follow Dr. Mekel and Bloomwell as well for everything they're going to be doing.
Hmm.
Dr. Mekel has grief education courses, such
Yeah.
as she has an upcoming one that she hasn't dropped yet, but I'm on
Hmm.
the wait list for that one. So cortisol coping conversation. She
Yes.
also has the Grief Anatomy Toolkit
Hmm.
and another course called Reimagining Life After Loss. Amongst,
Yeah.
I mean, you do Enneagram, you do like too many things, right? Too many things of
Mm.
amazingness. So check her out, purchase some of her courses or
Yeah.
her book. And where can our listeners find you? I know you shared a couple of your handles,
Yeah.
but maybe just share them again
Hmm.
and anywhere else that you want to direct our listeners to.
Yeah. So on cross social media platforms, you can follow me at Dr. Mekel, Drmekel. I'm primarily enjoying space on Instagram. And so I love doing education, and you'll see all my reels and fun stuff there. If you click the link in my bio, you'll access everything Joelle talked about and more. You can also meet me on my website. It's mekelharrisphd.com. And then with Bloomwell, it's growwithbloomwell.com. So, Joelle, I just want to thank you
Wow.
for, again, inviting me to the table. I never take that for granted. I love your spirit. I love the um, energy with which you bring these conversations forward. And I'm just so grateful. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
we have to end somewhere, and we will end there for today. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mekel, for your time, for your blessings, for your
Mhm.
knowledge that you're forging forward in the world and
Thank you.
helping us all grow alongside you. So
Mhm.
thank you. And that's it for today, dear listeners, for the House of Mourning.